They whispered that the Valkyrie died in the Kandahar Valley. To the staff at St. Jude's Trauma Center, she was just Nurse Bennett, the invisible woman who cleaned bedpans and took insults without blinking. But the charade ended the moment Sergeant David Torres wheeled himself into the crowded corridor. He didn't look at the chief resident preening for the news cameras. He looked at the woman holding a chart. Ignoring his fresh sutures and the agony in his legs, the sergeant forced himself to stand. The hallway fell dead silent. With a trembling hand, he snapped a razor-sharp salute. "Major on deck," he barked, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "We thought you were Kia, ma'am." The woman didn't shrink away. She didn't deny it. For the first time in 5 years, she shifted her feet and stood at attention. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that Rachel Bennett knew better than her own heartbeat. She moved through the trauma bay with an efficiency that made her invisible, a ghost in blue scrubs. She was the grease in a chaotic machine, silently correcting dosage errors and calming terrified patients, all while wearing a mask of absolute indifference. "Nurse, are you deaf or just stupid?" The voice cracked through the air like a whip. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the hospital's media darling chief resident, stood over the bed of a senator's son, glaring at Rachel. Thorne was handsome for the cameras but incompetent with a scalpel. "I said hand me the clamps, not the retractors. You're here to assist, not to think." Rachel didn't flinch. She simply handed him the instrument, her eyes flat. She was calculating the patient's dropping O2 levels while Thorne worried about his hair for the press release. In the shadows of the hallway, sitting in a wheelchair, a man was watching. Sergeant David Torres looked rough, shrapnel wounds bandaged, eyes dark with exhaustion. He had been waiting hours for a transfer. But he wasn't looking at the doctors. He was watching the nurse. He noticed what others missed, the way she stood at parade rest when idle, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind her back. The way her eyes scanned the room, not with fear but with threat assessment. "I know that stance," Torres thought. "I've seen that calm in the middle of a firefight." Suddenly the building shuddered. Thunder boomed and the hospital grid failed. The lights died. The ventilators in the OR stopped. Total darkness. "The backup generators are down," someone screamed. In the dark, Dr. Thorne panicked. "I can't see. The boy is crashing. Someone get a flashlight." He was freezing up, his hands shaking, abandoning the patient. Rachel moved. It wasn't the movement of a nurse. It was a blur of tactical precision. She shoved Thorne aside in the pitch black. "Bag valve mask now," she commanded, her voice dropping an octave into pure authority. She didn't need light. She worked by feel, her fingers dancing over the patient's throat, executing a manual ventilation technique that hadn't been used since field medicine in the 90s. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, Thorne was pressed against the wall, pale and sweating. Rachel was hand-pumping oxygen into the boy, her rhythm perfect. Torres, watching from the door, felt a chill run down his spine. The blind stitch. He had only seen one surgeon perform a procedure in total darkness by sound alone. As Rachel wiped a smear of blood from her cheek, Torres saw the scar on her forearm, the jagged remnant of a helicopter crash. He didn't just know her. He owed her his life. The sterile scent of St. Jude's Trauma Center was supposed to smell like safety, but to Rachel Bennett, it smelled like a lie. At 42, Rachel had mastered the art of becoming furniture. She was the ice queen of the ER floor, a moniker the residents whispered when they thought she was out of earshot. They mocked her silence, her refusal to engage in break-room gossip, and the robotic precision with which she scrubbed blood from the trauma bays. They didn't know that silence was a discipline, not a personality trait. In the noise of a level 1 trauma center, silence was the only place she could hide the ghost that followed her home every night. Rachel stood at the central nursing station, her eyes scanning the digital chart for bed 4. The patient was a 70-year-old male with early-onset renal failure. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the hospital's golden boy and chief resident, had just signed off on the morning medication orders. Thorne was a man who spent more time curating his LinkedIn profile than reviewing patient labs. He moved through the hospital like a celebrity, his white coat tailored to accentuate his gym-honed physique, his smile practiced for the donors who frequented the VIP wing. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she read the order. Digoxin 2.5 mg 4 push. Her hand stopped mid-air. The standard loading dose was 0.25 mg. A decimal point error. A simple slip of a finger on a keyboard that would stop the patient's heart within minutes of administration. It was the kind of mistake interns made in their first week, not a chief resident on the fast track to administration. Rachel didn't make a scene. She didn't call out across the busy floor. She simply unlocked the cart, pulled the correct 0.25 milligrams vial, and logged the correction in the digital notes, flagging it as a transcription error to save Thorne the embarrassment. She was drawing up the syringe when the shadow fell over her. Nurse Bennett. The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with venom. Rachel turned. Dr. Thorne was looming over her, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. He wasn't looking at the patient. He was looking at the tablet in her hand. "I noticed you altered my order," Thorne said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of 3 medical students standing nearby. "Is there a reason you believe you're qualified to second-guess my pharmacological decisions?" "It was a decimal error, doctor," Rachel said, her voice flat and devoid of challenge. "The order read 2.5 milligrams. The patient is in renal failure. That dose would be lethal." Thorne's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He snatched the tablet from her, scrolling through the log. He saw the mistake, but admitting it would shatter the image of perfection he cultivated so aggressively. He looked at the students, then back at Rachel. "He chose the ego." "I was titrating based on his resistance," Thorne lied, the falsehood slipping out easily. "But I suppose a nurse wouldn't understand the nuances of aggressive cardiac therapy. You are here to follow orders, Bennett, not to play doctor. If you ever change a chart without my verbal authorization again, I will have you stripped of your license and scrubbing toilets in the basement. Do you understand?" The ER went quiet. The medical students looked at their shoes, embarrassed for her. Rachel felt the familiar heat of anger deep in her gut, a relic from a life where incompetence got people killed in the sand, but she buried it under 5 years of discipline. "Understood, doctor," she said softly. Thorne sneered, satisfied with her submission. He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence, just as the double doors of the ambulance bay burst open. "Trauma incoming," a paramedic screamed, his voice cracking with urgency. "Male, 30s, multiple shrapnel wounds, severe blood loss. He's combat vets, looks like an IED flashback. He's fighting us." The gurney slammed into the bay, the wheels screeching against the linoleum. On the mattress, a man was thrashing against the leather restraints. Sergeant David Torres was a ruin of a man. His leg was heavily bandaged, blood soaking through the gauze, but his eyes were wide open and seeing things that weren't there. He wasn't in St. Jude's. In his mind, he was still in the Corango Valley. "Get him into Trauma 1, a junior resident shouted, looking around for Thorne, but the chief resident was already walking away. "I have a meeting with Senator Sterling," Thorne called out over his shoulder, checking his Rolex. "Handle the stray, Bennett. Page the on-call if he codes." Rachel moved before the order was even finished. She ran alongside the gurney, dodging the flailing arm of the delirious soldier. Torres was screaming orders at a phantom platoon, his voice raw. "Incoming. Get down. We need a evac." Torres roared, his eyes locking onto the ceiling tiles but seeing the sky. "Hold him down," the paramedic grunted. "He's ripped his IVs." Rachel stepped into the chaos. She didn't shout. She moved with a fluid, heavy grace that defied her slender frame. She grabbed Torres's uninjured shoulder, leaning in close to his ear. The other nurses flinched, expecting her to be struck, but Rachel knew exactly where to apply pressure to ground a soldier in panic. "Easy, Sergeant," she whispered, her tone shifting from the hospital monotone to a sharp command cadence. "The bird is here. You're inside the wire. Stand down." The effect was instantaneous. Torres blinked, his breathing ragged. He stopped fighting the straps. His eyes, wild and dilated, scanned the room before locking onto Rachel's face. He stared at her, confusion warring with a deep, buried memory. He looked at her eyes, not the nurse's eyes but the predator's eyes behind them. The Valkyrie? He wheezed, the name bubbling up through blood and saliva. Rachel froze. Her hand tightened on the bed rail, her knuckles turning white. It was a name she hadn't heard since the funeral she never attended. A name that belonged to a ghost. She looked around quickly, but the chaos of the ER masked his whisper. "You're hallucinating, soldier," Rachel said, her voice trembling imperceptibly. "Just breathe." She stabilized him, her hands moving with a speed that the junior residents couldn't track, setting lines and packing wounds. Once he was sedated, she stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed air. She walked out of the trauma bay and into the main corridor, needing to escape the ghost that had just walked through the door. Down the hall, near the VIP elevators, the atmosphere changed from blood and sweat to lavender and money. Dr. Thorne stood there, his white coat pristine, laughing at something Senator Sterling said. The senator, a heavy-set man with the weight of the state regarding his shoulders, looked anxious. "My son is my world, Marcus," the senator said, gripping Thorne's hand. "This surgery, the press is already outside." "Senator, please," Thorne said, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder, flashing his perfect teeth. "It's a routine vessel ligation. I've done 1,000 of them. Your boy is in the hands of the best surgeon in the state. I'll be personally handling the procedure." Rachel watched from the shadows. She knew Thorne hadn't done a vessel ligation in 6 months. She knew he delegated the hard work to the fellows and took the credit. And she knew that the storm warning flashing on the TV monitor above the nurse's station, a red band of severe weather moving toward the city, was the one variable Thorne's ego couldn't control. Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of the hospital entrance, vibrating the floor beneath Rachel's feet. The overhead lights flickered once, then twice. Thorne didn't notice. He was too busy shaking hands. But Rachel looked up at the fluorescent bulbs, feeling the hair on her arms stand up. The atmospheric pressure was dropping fast. The monster wasn't just in the trauma bay anymore, it was coming for the whole building. As the first crack of thunder shook the foundation, Rachel looked back at the sedated sergeant in Trauma 1, and then at the fraud smiling at the senator. The lights flickered a third time, longer now, plunging the corridor into a second of terrifying darkness before buzzing back to life. But in that brief second of black, Rachel knew one thing with absolute certainty. The power was going to fail, and when it did, the man in the expensive suit was going to kill the boy in the operating room. The storm hit St. Jude's not with a whisper, but with a violent, concussive slam. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows of the operating theater like gravel thrown by a blast wave. Inside or 3, the air was pressurized and cool, a sterile bubble separated from the chaos outside, but the tension was already palpable. Dr. Marcus Thorne stood over the open abdominal cavity of 20-year-old Julian Sterling. The senator's son was draped in blue sterile sheets, his chest rising and falling to the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Thorne held the scalpel with a grip that was too tight, his knuckles white inside the latex. He had nicked a vessel moments ago, a clumsy error, and the field was filling with dark venous blood faster than the suction could clear it. Suction. More suction. Thorne snapped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "Why is this field so wet? I can't see the landmarks." "Pressure is dropping, doctor," the anesthesiologist warned, her voice tight. "BP is 90/60. You need to clamp that bleeder." "I know what I need to do," Thorne shouted. He dove his hand into the cavity, blindly clamping, praying he caught the vessel and not the ureter. Then the world ended. A deafening crack of thunder shook the building, and the overhead surgical lights, 4,000 watts of halogen brilliance, died instantly. The room plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Generators!" Thorne screamed into the black void. "Where are the backups?" A low groan vibrated through the floorboards as the hospital's main power reserves kicked in. Light flooded the hallway outside, visible through the small viewing window, but OR3 remained pitch black. A surge had tripped the localized breaker for the surgical wing. The monitors flickered and died, switching to their internal emergency batteries, casting a ghostly, insufficient green glow that barely reached the table. "I can't see." Thorne's voice pitched up into panic. "I have a bleeder. I need light. Someone get a flashlight, a phone, anything." "Doctor, his pressure is crashing," the anesthesiologist cried out, the battery-powered pulse oximeter beginning to shriek a high-low alarm. 50/30. He's bleeding out. Thorne froze. In the dark, stripped of his technology and his audience, he was nothing. He could hear the wet, sickening sound of blood pooling in the cavity. He jammed his hands into the wound, grabbing blindly at slippery tissue, but he had no orientation. He was tearing more than he was fixing. "I'm losing him," Thorne whispered, the arrogance draining out of him. "I can't. I don't know where it is." The doors to the OR hissed open. A silhouette appeared against the dim light of the hallway. It didn't rush. It didn't shout. It moved with the predatory silence of someone who had learned to operate under fire. Rachel Bennett stepped into the room. She didn't look at Thorne. She didn't look at the panicked nurses. She walked straight to the table, her eyes adjusting instantly to the gloom. To her, this wasn't a disaster. It was a Tuesday in Kandahar. "Step aside," Rachel said. It wasn't a request. Bennett? Thorne spluttered, his hands shaking deep inside the patient. Get out. I need a surgeon, not a... Rachel hip-checked him hard. The force sent Thorne stumbling back into the instrument tray, clattering metal onto the floor. Rachel took his place. She didn't ask for a light. She closed her eyes. Retractor, she commanded, extending a bloody hand. The scrub nurse, paralyzed by shock, instinctively slapped the instrument into her palm. Rachel didn't look down. She didn't need to. She plunged her hands into the warm, slick abdomen of the senator's son. She ignored the visual chaos and focused on the tactile map in her mind. She felt the pulse of the aorta, the rigid line of the spine, and then the hot, turbulent jet of the severed artery. There. Suture. 2-0 silk. Now. You can't see, the anesthesiologist gasped. You'll sew the bowel. I said, give me the suture. Rachel grabbed the needle driver. In the dark, she executed a maneuver forbidden in civilian medicine, the blind stitch. It was a technique born of desperation in forward operating bases where electricity was a luxury and exsanguination was a certainty. She guided the needle with the tip of her left index finger, feeling the tear in the vessel wall. Pull, drag, pull. She worked by sound and touch alone. The squelch of the blood. The tension of the thread. She threw a knot, cinched it down, and felt the turbulent flow stop against her fingertip. Cut, she said. She did it again, reinforcing the tie. Pull, drag, pull. The room was silent save for the storm raging outside and the frantic beeping of the monitor. Then the rhythm changed. The beeping slowed. It steadied. BP is rising, the anesthesiologist whispered, disbelief coloring her tone. 80, 90 over 60. He's stabilizing. Rachel exhaled a long, slow breath through her nose. She pulled her hands out of the cavity and stripped off her gloves. He's secure, she said to the darkness. Suction the field and close him up. At that exact moment, the breakers reset. The overhead lights blasted on with blinding intensity, flooding the room in white. The sudden brightness was violent, exposing the scene in high definition. Rachel stood by the table, her scrubs smeared with blood, her face an unreadable mask of calm. Dr. Thorne was pressed against the back wall, his hands held up as if to ward off a blow, his face pale and sweating. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from the stable monitor to the perfectly ligated vessel in the boy's abdomen, and finally, to the nurse who had just performed a miracle he couldn't even comprehend. Rachel turned to leave, but Thorne pushed himself off the wall. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced instantly by a sharp, calculating glint of malice. He looked at the medical team, then at the open door where the hallway cameras might see in. He realized two things simultaneously. The senator's son was alive, and the woman standing in front of him held the power to destroy his entire career. You. Thorne breathed, stepping forward, his voice low and dangerous. What did you just do? The silence in operating room 3 was heavy, suffocating, and broken only by the steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor, the sound of a life that shouldn't have been saved. Dr. Marcus Thorne stared at the monitor, then at the perfectly ligated vessel, and finally at Rachel. The fear that had paralyzed him moments ago evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, sharp realization. She had seen him fail. Worse, she had succeeded where he had frozen. Rachel reached for a piece of gauze to wipe the blood from her forearm. The artery is tied off, doctor. You can close. Don't touch anything. Thorne barked, recoiling as if she were contagious. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, gauging the reactions of the scrub nurses and the anesthesiologist. They were looking at Rachel with awe. He had to kill that look before it spread. Thorne ripped his mask down, his face twisted in a snarl. You contaminated the field. You just shoved your unsterile hands into a VIP patient's abdominal cavity in the dark. Do you have any idea what you've done? I saved his life, Rachel said calmly, her voice low. He was bleeding out. You froze. I was assessing the situation. Thorne screamed, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. I was waiting for the generators. You recklessly endangered the life of Senator Sterling's son with your cowboy antics. Look at this mess. Infection risk is now 100%. If this boy dies of sepsis, it's on your head. The doors whooshed open again. This time it wasn't a savior. It was Mrs. Halloway, the hospital administrator, flanked by 2 security guards. She looked from the blood-spattered floor to Thorne's flushed face. What is going on here? Halloway demanded, her voice tight with the stress of the blackout. Senator Sterling is outside pacing a hole in the floor. Is the boy alive? Thorne stepped forward, smoothing his white coat, instantly transforming from a panicked child into the authoritative chief resident. "The patient is stable, no thanks to Nurse Bennett," Thorne said, pointing an accusatory finger at Rachel. "During the power failure, she suffered a psychotic break. She physically assaulted me, hip-checked me away from the table, and performed an unauthorized, unsterile procedure. She compromised the entire surgery." The anesthesiologist opened her mouth to speak, to say that Rachel had performed a miracle, but Thorne shot her a glare so venomous it silenced her. "I had to salvage the vessel after she mangled it," Thorne lied smoothly. "But the liability? Mrs. Halloway, we are looking at a massive malpractice suit if the senator finds out a nurse was playing surgeon in the dark." Halloway turned to Rachel. Her face was hard, calculating the PR cost rather than the truth. "Is this true? Did you touch the patient without an attending's direct order?" Rachel looked at Halloway, then at Thorne. She saw the political calculus in their eyes. The truth didn't matter. The narrative mattered. Thorne was the hospital's star. She was expendable inventory. "I stopped the bleeding," Rachel said, her posture rigid. "Did Dr. Thorne authorize you to scrub in?" Halloway asked, her voice dipping into a dangerous register. "No." "Then you are done." Halloway didn't blink. "This is gross insubordination and battery. We cannot have rogue staff assaulting surgeons. Hand over your badge, Miss Bennett. You are terminated effective immediately." Rachel didn't beg. She didn't plead her case or point to the boy whose heart was still beating because of her unauthorized hands. She simply reached up, unclipped her ID badge and placed it on the sterile tray next to the bloody scalpel. "Good luck with the closure, doctor," Rachel said. "Watch the ureter. You nearly clipped it twice." She turned and walked out of the OR, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. 10 minutes later, Rachel stood in the locker room, the adrenaline fading into a dull, gray ache. She pulled off the blood-stained scrubs, dropping them into the biohazard bin with a wet thud. She dressed in her civilian clothes, faded jeans and a dark hoodie, and opened her locker. There wasn't much to pack. A stethoscope she had owned since her residency at Walter Reed. A spare pair of socks. A photo of a unit that no longer existed, taped to the inside of the metal door. She peeled the photo off carefully, sliding it into her pocket. She was used to this. The world didn't want warriors. It wanted heroes who looked good on camera. She had done her job. The boy would live. That had to be enough. She picked up her cardboard box and walked out into the main corridor. The hospital was returning to normal. The lights were steady. The panic was subsiding. She kept her head down, moving toward the exit, invisible once again. But as she passed the waiting area near the elevators, a sound stopped her cold. It wasn't the beep of a monitor or the page of a doctor. It was the distinct, metallic crash of an 4-pole hitting the floor, followed by the heavy, dragging sound of a wheelchair moving with aggressive purpose. "Get out of my way," a voice roared, raspy, drugged, but unmistakably familiar. Rachel froze, her hand tightening on the box. She looked up. Down the long corridor, pushing through a phalanx of confused nurses, was a man in a wheelchair, trailing tubes and wires like broken chains. He wasn't looking at the exit. He was looking for a fight. And he was heading straight for her. The morphine drip was a warm, heavy blanket, trying to smother the fire in Sergeant David Torres's legs, but it couldn't drown out the noise in the hallway. To a civilian, the hospital corridor was a cacophony of beeps and footsteps. To a recon Marine, it was a threat environment. And right now the threat was loud. Torres swam up through the chemical fog, his eyes snapping open. The ceiling tiles spun, then steadied. He wasn't in the Karengal anymore. He was in St. Jude's. He remembered the ambush, the helicopter, the pain. But mostly he remembered the voice in the trauma bay. It wasn't the frantic, high-pitched squawking of the doctors. It was a command voice, low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. A voice he hadn't heard since the day his squad died. "Remove her from the premises immediately," a man's voice echoed from the corridor. It was the same oily voice that had dismissed him earlier. "If she resists, call the police." Torres's heart hammered against his ribs. The Valkyrie. They were throwing her out. He tried to sit up and the world tilted on its axis. Pain exploded in his left thigh, white-hot and blinding. He grit his teeth, a guttural growl vibrating in his chest. He looked at the tangle of plastic tubing anchoring him to the bed. The 4-line. The monitors. They were chains. With a trembling hand, Torres grabbed the tape securing the 4 to his forearm. He didn't peel it gently. He ripped it. The needle tore free and a stream of dark venous blood tracked down his wrist, dripping onto the pristine white sheets. He didn't feel it. Adrenaline, sharp and cold, flooded his system, overriding the injury. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. His vision grayed out for a second, black spots dancing in his periphery. He grabbed the heavy steel wheelchair sitting in the corner, dragging it closer with a metallic screech. "Sir? Sir, you need to stay in bed." A nurse appeared in the doorway, her eyes going wide at the sight of the blood. "Back off," Torres rasped. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer intensity of it froze her in her tracks. He hauled his body into the chair, his muscles screaming in protest. He didn't wait for assistance. He grabbed the wheels, his knuckles white, and shoved off. The rubber tires squealed against the linoleum as he picked up speed. He wasn't a patient anymore. He was on a mission. Out in the main corridor, the humiliation was already underway. Rachel walked with her head high, clutching a cardboard box to her chest. She was flanked by two burly security guards, treating her like a criminal. Behind them, Dr. Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered on his face as he watched the problem disappear. The nurses whispered behind their hands. The betrayal was absolute. Rachel stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone. She had accepted the outcome. She would leave quietly. She would vanish just like she had 5 years ago. Then the sound of aggressive momentum broke the murmurs. Whir, clack, whir, clack. Torres accelerated out of the recovery wing, cutting the corner so hard one wheel lifted off the ground. He maneuvered the chair directly into the center of the hallway, putting himself squarely in the path of the security guards. "Halt!" Torres barked. The volume was startling, coming from a man who looked half dead. The security guard stopped, confused. Rachel looked up, her eyes widening slightly. She saw the blood dripping from his arm, the sweat soaking his hospital gown, and the fierce, wild recognition in his eyes. "Sir, you need to go back to your room," the lead guard said, stepping forward. "We are escorting a terminated employee." "Stand down," Torres growled. He locked the brakes on his wheelchair with a violent click. He ignored the guards. He ignored the nurses. He looked past them, locking eyes with the woman in the faded blue scrubs. He didn't see a nurse. He didn't see a fired employee. He saw the dust of Afghanistan. He saw the smoke. He saw the woman who had knelt in the mud while mortars walked toward their position, sewing him back together while the world burned. Torres took a breath, his chest heaving. Slowly, fighting the agony in his core, he straightened his spine. He raised his right hand, slicing through the air with a precision that cut through the hospital's sterile atmosphere. He held the salute, rigid, unwavering. "Major on deck." Torres shouted, his voice cracking with the weight of 5 years of grief. "Permission to speak, ma'am?" The hallway went deathly silent. The security guards looked at each other, unsure whether to tackle a wounded veteran. Dr. Thorne's smirk faltered, his brow furrowing in confusion. Rachel didn't move. She stared at the sergeant, her breath catching in her throat. The box in her hands felt suddenly heavy. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, and the pain of recognition flashed across her face. She wasn't Nurse Bennett. In the reflection of his eyes, she was Major Rachel Bennett, 1st Battalion Surgical. "At ease, Sergeant," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Torres didn't drop the salute. He looked at Thorne, then back at Rachel, his eyes burning with a revelation that was about to shatter the hospital's reality. "They don't know, do they?" Torres said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "They don't know who you are." Thorne stepped forward, his arrogance returning. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Security, get this drug-addled grunt back to his bed. He's hallucinating. He thinks the nurse is an officer." Torres slowly lowered his hand, turning his gaze toward Thorne. The look he gave the doctor was colder than the grave. "Hallucinating?" Torres said softly. "I'm the only one here with his eyes open." He reached into his gown pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained coin, a unit challenge coin. He flipped it onto the floor. It spun with a metallic ring, settling at Thorne's feet. "Pick it up," Torres challenged. "Read the inscription. And then tell me again who you just fired." The coin lay on the linoleum, a dull brass circle amidst the sterile white. Dr. Marcus Thorne didn't bend down to pick it up. He kicked it aside with the tip of his polished Italian loafer. "I don't have time for show and tell, soldier," Thorne sneered, signaling the security guards to move in. "This isn't a VFW hall. It's a place of science." "Science?" Torres laughed, a harsh, barking sound that made the nearby nurses flinch. He gripped the wheels of his chair, turning his body to face the gathering crowd of staff, patients, and administrators. "You think science saved me? Look at my chart, doctor." "Go ahead. Read the surgical notes from October 2018. Thorne rolled his eyes, checking his watch. I'm sure the VA did a wonderful job patching you up. The VA didn't touch me until I was stateside, Torres said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that carried further than a shout. I was in the Karengal Valley. We were ambushed. RPG took out the lead Humvee. I had a piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate in my femoral artery. He pointed a shaking finger at Rachel, who stood frozen, clutching her box of belongings like a shield. My medic was dead, Torres continued, his eyes locked on her. We were pinned down, taking effective fire from the ridge. And out of the smoke comes this woman. No armor. No weapon. Just a med kit. A few of the nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The conviction in Torres's voice was magnetic. Even Mrs. Halloway, the administrator, paused, her frown deepening. She didn't drag me to cover, Torres said, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. There was no cover. She knelt over me in the kill zone. She clamped the artery with her bare hands while rounds were chewing up the dirt 2 feet from her head. She held that bleed for 45 minutes until the medevac arrived. She kept me alive by sheer force of will. He slammed his hand on the armrest of his wheelchair. They called her the Valkyrie because she decided who lived and who died. And you? He turned his burning gaze back to Thorne. You think you can fire her? You aren't fit to wash her scrubs. For a second, the hallway was silent. The image of the quiet, bedpan-cleaning nurse juxtaposed against the legend of the Valkyrie was too jarring for the staff to process. Then Thorne laughed. It was a cold, incredulous sound. This is pathetic, Thorne announced, shaking his head. Truly. It's a touching delusion, Sergeant, but look at her. He gestured dismissively at Rachel. Does she look like a war hero to you? She's a nurse who was just terminated for nearly killing a patient. She's not a major. She's a liability. Thorne took a step toward Torres, leaning down with a cruel, patronizing smile. You're high on Dilaudid, my friend. You're confused. You're seeing ghosts because your brain is fried from the war and the painkillers. Now, move this chair before I have you sedated and strapped down. Rachel stepped forward. The insult to Torres cut through her restraint in a way the insults to herself never could. Leave him alone, Marcus, she said, her voice low but hard. Oh, the mute speaks, Thorne mocked. Go home, Bennett. Take your little fan club with you. Rachel looked at Torres. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the need for his reality to be validated. But she also saw the security guards shifting, hands hovering near their belts. She couldn't let this escalate. She couldn't risk exposure. The investigation into the Kandahar op was still classified. If she admitted who she was, she wouldn't just lose her job, she could face a court-martial for disappearing. David, Rachel said softly, using his first name. It's okay. Stand down, Marine. I'm leaving. She tried to step around the wheelchair. Torres moved the chair instantly, blocking her path again. No, ma'am, he said, his voice thick with stubborn loyalty. He refused to look at Thorne. He looked only at her. I don't take orders from civilians. And right now you're acting like one. David, please, Rachel hissed, leaning in. You're making a scene. I'm establishing the chain of command, Torres countered. He sat up straighter, ignoring the blood seeping through the bandages on his leg. He raised his hand in a salute again, holding it rigid. I am not moving until you acknowledge your rank, Major. You earned it. Don't let this empty suit take it from you. I am not a major anymore, Rachel pleaded, her eyes darting to the curious faces of the residents. Once a Marine, always a Marine, Torres said. I'm waiting, ma'am. The standoff stretched. The air in the corridor was electric. Thorne looked ready to shove the wheelchair over himself. Rachel stood trapped between her past and her present, the box in her hands feeling like a coffin for the life she was trying to leave behind. She looked at Torres's trembling hand, the respect etched into his pain-racked face. She took a breath. Her posture shifted. Her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly. The urge to return the salute, to honor the bond they shared in the blood and dirt, twitched in her right hand. Thorne opened his mouth to order the guards to tackle the sergeant. But before he could speak, the shrill, terrifying sound of the Code Blue alarm shattered the silence. Code Blue. VIP suite. Code Blue. The overhead speakers blared. Thorne's face went white. The smirk vanished. That's the senator's son, a nurse whispered, horror dawning on her face. Thorne froze. He looked at the elevator, then at his hands, panic flooding his eyes. He had fixed the vessel, or he thought he had. But if the boy was coding now, it meant the repair had failed. And everyone in the hallway knew exactly who had touched the patient last. Torres didn't look at the alarm. He kept his eyes on Rachel, his salute wavering slightly as his strength faded, but his gaze holding her fast. "Sounds like they need a surgeon, ma'am," Torres whispered. "What are your orders?" The shrill, rhythmic shriek of the code blue alarm didn't just break the tension in the hallway, it shattered the hospital's fragile facade of control. The automated voice over the PA system was relentless, a metronome of disaster. "Code blue. VIP Suite 1. Code blue. VIP Suite 1. Dr. Marcus Thorne didn't look at the sergeant anymore. He didn't look at the coin on the floor or the woman he had just fired. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking less like a chief resident and more like a man watching his own execution. He spun on his heel, his expensive Italian loafers slipping slightly on the polished floor, and sprinted toward the elevators. "Move. Get out of the way." Thorne screamed, shoving a bewildered orderly into the wall. Rachel stood rooted to the spot. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a rhythm she hadn't felt since the dust-off chopper lifted off from the ambush site. Every instinct in her body, honed by years of trauma medicine, screamed at her to run toward the dying patient. But the box in her hands felt like an anchor. "You are a civilian," her mind whispered. "You are fired. You are nothing." Sergeant Torres didn't look at the fleeing doctor. He looked up at Rachel, his eyes burning with an intensity that cut through her doubt. He lowered his salute slowly, his expression shifting from reverence to expectation. "That boy is going to die, ma'am," Torres said, his voice rough. "Unless you go." Rachel looked at the elevator doors closing on Thorne. She looked at the box of personal effects. With a sudden, decisive movement, she dropped the box. It hit the floor with a dull thud, spilling her stethoscope and the picture of her dead squad across the tiles. She didn't run. She moved with a terrifyingly swift purpose, following the path of the doctor. Up on the VIP floor, the scene was a tableau of horror. The suite, designed to look more like a hotel room than a hospital, was in chaos. A crash cart had been shoved against a mahogany dresser. 2 nurses were taking turns doing compressions on Julian Sterling, the senator's son. The boy was pale, a ghostly waxen white against the high thread count sheets. Senator Sterling was pressed against the far wall, held back by a security guard. The powerful politician was reduced to a weeping father, his hands gripping the lapels of his suit jacket until his knuckles turned white. "Do something." Sterling screamed as Thorne burst into the room. "He was fine. You said he was stable." Thorne pushed past the nurses, his eyes wide and panicked. "Stop compressions. Check the rhythm." "PA," a nurse shouted. "Pulseless electrical activity. We have a rhythm on the monitor but no pulse." "He's empty, doctor. He's bled out." "That's impossible," Thorne stammered, grabbing the patient's chart as if the answer would be written there. "I ligated the vessel. I fixed it." "The abdomen is distended, doctor," the nurse yelled, panic rising in her voice. "Look at the drain. It's full." Thorne looked. The suction canister was filled with bright, red arterial blood. The ligation hadn't held. Or worse, in his haste to close the patient after Rachel left, he had missed a secondary bleeder deep in the retroperitoneal space. "Open him up," Thorne ordered, his voice cracking. "Get me a tray." "Here, doctor." A nurse ripped open a sterile instrument pack. Thorne grabbed a scalpel, his hands shaking so violently the blade vibrated. He slashed the sutures he had placed only an hour ago. Blood welled up instantly, dark and angry. It wasn't just a leak, it was a deluge. The boy's abdominal cavity was full of blood. "Suction," Thorne screamed. "I can't see anything." The suction gurgled, overwhelmed. Thorne plunged his hands into the warm blood, frantically feeling for the source. But it was everywhere. The anatomy was distorted, slippery, and unrecognizable. He was lost in the red dark. "Where is it? Where is it?" Thorne whispered, a mantra of failure. "Dr. Thorne, SATs are 40%, the anesthesiologist shouted. "We are losing him. You have to clamp it now." Thorne froze. The room blurred around him. The beeping of the monitor seemed to slow down, warping into a deep, underwater groan. He looked at the open wound, then at the senator's face. He saw the end of his residency. He saw the lawsuits. He saw the headlines. I can't find it," Thorne choked out. He pulled his hands back, holding them up in surrender, blood dripping from his gloves onto the expensive carpet. "It's too deep. He's gone." "No." Senator Sterling lunged forward, breaking the guard's hold. He grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his white coat, smearing blood on the fabric. "Don't you dare give up. Save my son. You're the chief. Save him." Thorne stared at the senator, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the weight of his own fraudulence. He backed away, shaking his head, retreating from the dying boy. The monitor let out a long, flat tone. The heart had stopped. "Asystole," the nurse cried. The room fell into a horrific, suspended silence. The senator sobbed, collapsing to his knees. Thorne stood against the wall, a coward in a blood-spattered coat, watching the life drain out of the room. Then the heavy oak door to the suite slammed open. It wasn't security. It wasn't a chaplain. Rachel Bennett stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a white coat. She was wearing faded blue scrubs and a look of cold, tactical fury. She didn't look at the weeping father or the broken doctor. She looked at the monitor, then at the clock. "Resume compressions," she barked. The sound was so commanding, so utterly devoid of fear, that the nurse started pumping the chest before she even realized she was obeying. Rachel walked into the room, stripping off her jacket and rolling up her sleeves, revealing the jagged scar on her forearm. She walked straight toward Thorne, who was cowering against the wall. She didn't stop until she was inches from his face, smelling the fear on him. A security guard, breathless from the sprint up the stairs, lunged for Rachel's arm. "Ms. Bennett, you are trespassing. I need you to." Rachel didn't look at him. She didn't flinch. She simply rotated her shoulder, breaking his grip with a sharp, disciplined torque of her body that sent him stumbling into the doorframe. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that stopped him dead. "Stand down," she ordered. It wasn't a shout, it was a detonation. The guard froze, his instinct to subdue a hysterical woman short-circuiting against the reality of a combat officer taking ground. Rachel turned her back on him and walked past Dr. Thorne. The chief resident was still pressed against the wall, his hands shaking, his eyes wide with the paralysis of a man watching his career bleed out on the carpet. He opened his mouth to protest, to cite protocol or liability, but the look Rachel gave him severed the words in his throat. It was a look of absolute contempt, the way a wolf looks at a dog that doesn't know how to hunt. "Get out of my kill zone," she whispered. She stepped up to the bedside. The room was a cacophony of panic. Nurses crying, the monitor screaming a flatline, the senator sobbing on the floor. "Quiet," Rachel barked. The silence that followed was instantaneous. The residents, the nurses, even the senator looked at her. They were drowning, and she was the only solid thing in the room. "Gloves," she commanded, holding out her hand to the nearest nurse. The nurse hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Thorne, then back at Rachel. The sheer force of Rachel's presence overrode the hospital hierarchy. The nurse slapped a pair of size 7 latex gloves into Rachel's palm. Rachel snapped them on. "Stop compressions. You're just pumping the remaining volume into his abdomen. Raise the bed. Trendelenburg position. Now." The residents moved. They didn't ask why. They instinctively recognized the cadence of authority. The bed tilted, sending blood to the boy's brain. "Scalpel. We don't have a sterile field," a resident stammered, holding the blade. "He's dead," Rachel said cold and low. "Infection is a problem for tomorrow. Give me the blade." She snatched the scalpel. With a single, fluid motion, she reopened the incision Thorne had hastily stapled shut. Dark blood welled up, spilling over the sheets and onto the floor. The smell of iron filled the small VIP suite. Senator Sterling retched, burying his face in his hands, but he didn't look away. He watched the woman in the faded scrubs dive her hands into his son's body. Rachel worked with a terrifying speed. She didn't look for the bleeder Thorne had missed. There was too much blood. She went for the source. She shoved the intestines aside, her fingers diving deep toward the spine, hunting for the abdominal aorta. "Suction is useless," she called out. "I'm going in blind. Time check." 3 minutes of asystole, the anesthesiologist replied, her voice trembling but clear. "Push 1 amp of AP. Get 2 units of Oneg ready on the rapid infuser. I'm cross-clamping the aorta manually." Rachel's hand found the thick, pulsing rhythm of the main artery against the spine, except it wasn't pulsing. It was flaccid. Empty. She slid her fingers higher, past the renal arteries until she found the tear. Thorne hadn't just nicked a vessel. In his panic, he had partially avulsed the renal vein. "Found it," Rachel hissed. She didn't wait for instruments. She clamped the aorta against the vertebrae with her fist, cutting off blood flow to the lower body to preserve the heart and brain. Then, with her other hand, she reached blindly into the pool of blood, finding the torn vein. "Clamp," she ordered. Long curved. Put it in my hand. The resident slapped the metal into her bloody palm. Rachel guided the instrument down. Click, click. Release pressure, she said. She slowly lifted her fist. The welling of blood stopped. Check the pulse, Rachel ordered, her eyes fixed on the open cavity. The room held its breath. The monitor remained a flat line. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Come on, Rachel whispered, the first crack in her armor showing. Fight, Marine. Beep. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Beep, beep. We have a rhythm, the anesthesiologist shouted, tears streaming down her face. Sinus bradycardia. Pressure is coming up. 60/40. Rachel didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She kept her hand on the clamp, her body rigid. Don't celebrate yet. He needs volume. Hang the blood. Squeeze it in. She looked up, sweat matting her hair to her forehead. Across the room, Thorne was sliding down the wall, his face buried in his hands. But Rachel wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door. Heavy, synchronized footsteps were thundering down the hallway. Not security guards. Not doctors. The door to the suite swung open, hitting the stop with a crash. 2 military police officers in full dress uniforms stepped in, flanking the entrance. They scanned the room, weapons holstered but hands ready. Behind them, a tall man with silver hair and 4 stars on his shoulder boards walked in. The room went stiff. General Sterling, the boy's grandfather, had arrived. He took in the blood, the weeping senator, the cowering doctor, and finally, the woman standing deep in the gore, holding his grandson's life in her hands. The general stopped. His steel-gray eyes locked onto Rachel's bloody face. He didn't look at her name tag. He looked at her scar. Report, the general barked. Report, Major. The command hung in the air, heavier than the silence of the cardiac monitor. It was a voice that didn't ask for permission. It demanded a situation report from a subordinate. For 5 years, Rachel Bennett had been trained to answer to Nurse Bennett, or simply, hey you. She had been conditioned to lower her eyes, to defer to men with half her experience and none of her trauma. But the voice of General 4-star Thomas Sterling bypassed the civilian conditioning and hot-wired the muscle memory of a decade of service. Rachel didn't look at the senator weeping in the corner. She didn't look at Dr. Thorne sliding down the wall in a puddle of failure. She snapped her heels together, a reflex that happened beneath the blood-soaked scrubs, and straightened her spine. Patient is stable, General, Rachel replied, her voice losing the soft, accommodating timbre of a nurse and hardening into the clipped, precise cadence of a field surgeon. Abdominal aorta was cross-clamped to preserve cerebral perfusion. The left renal vein had been avulsed. I performed a primary repair and verified hemostasis. BP is 90/60 and rising. He needs massive transfusion protocol and immediate ICU transfer, but the bleed is secured. The room was paralyzed. The residents stared at Rachel as if she had suddenly started speaking a dead language. Dr. Thorne, pulling himself up from the floor, looked between the general and the nurse, his face a mask of bewildered terror. He couldn't process what he was hearing. General Sterling, Thorne stammered, stepping forward with a desperate, trembling smile. I believe there is a misunderstanding. This woman is a terminated employee. She broke protocol. I was the one who... General Sterling didn't even blink. He didn't turn his head. He simply raised a single gloved finger. Secure him, the general said to the MPs. 2 military police officers moved with terrifying speed. They didn't grab Thorne gently. One of them stepped into Thorne's space, forcing him back against the mahogany dresser with a hard shove. Remain silent, sir, the MP barked. Thorne's mouth snapped shut. He looked around the room for support, but the hospital staff had retreated to the walls, sensing that the authority in the room had shifted from the hospital board to the Pentagon. General Sterling walked past the cowering doctor. His boots crunched on the broken glass of a saline ampoule. He walked straight into the pool of blood surrounding the bed, heedless of his pristine dress uniform. He stopped next to Rachel. He looked down at the boy, his grandson, whose chest was now rising and falling with a steady, strong rhythm. He looked at the impossible incision, the clamps holding the vein, the work of a surgeon who had refused to let death win. Then he looked at Rachel. He studied the lines around her eyes, the gray that had started to touch her temples, and the scar on her forearm that matched the one in the classified file on his desk. They told me you were dead, Rachel, the general said softly. The hardness in his eyes melted for a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound, aching relief. After the ambush in the valley, we searched for 3 days. We found the chopper. We found the bodies. But we never found you. I walked out, sir, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling slightly as the adrenaline dump hit her. I couldn't save them. My squad. I couldn't save any of them. I didn't deserve to come back. You saved Sergeant Torres, the general corrected firmly. And today you saved Julian. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a grandfather thanking a savior. You have been hiding in plain sight, Major, punishing yourself for a war that took everything from you. But the war is over. General, Thorne interrupted again, his ego unable to accept the reality unfolding before him. With all due respect, she is a nurse. She just performed surgery without a license. The liability. The general slowly turned to face Thorne. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Liability? General Sterling repeated the word as if it were a foul taste. Doctor, I have a squad of Marines in the hallway who just listened to a wounded sergeant describe how you belittled a decorated officer. I have the logs of this hospital's power grid failing. And I have 2 eyes that see a boy alive only because Major Bennett stepped in when you faltered. He signaled to the MPs. Get the logs from the OR. Secure the security footage from the hallway. And get the local police on the line. Police? Thorne squeaked. For her? No, the general said, his voice cold as steel. For you. Falsifying medical records. Criminal negligence. And I'm sure once we dig into your successful surgeries, we'll find more. Thorne slumped, the fight leaving him. Rachel unclipped the hemostat from the drape. Her hands were shaking now. The fight was over. The secret she had guarded for 5 years was out. She looked at the general, expecting to be arrested for AWOL, for desertion, for disappearing into the ghost of Elijah Bennett. I'm ready for the court-martial, sir, she said quietly, accepting her fate. General Sterling shook his head. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked old, worn soft by years of being carried. There will be no court-martial, Rachel, the general said, because I didn't come here just for my grandson. I came here because Sergeant Torres called my office 3 hours ago. He told me he found the Valkyrie. He unfolded the paper. It wasn't an arrest warrant. It was a set of orders. We have a situation, Major, the general said, his voice dropping to a whisper so only she could hear. And frankly, I don't give a damn about your nursing license. I need the surgeon who kept a platoon alive in hell. Rachel looked at the paper, then at the general's grim face. What situation? She asked. The general looked toward the window where the storm was still raging against the glass. There's something else in this hospital, Rachel. Something worse than a blackout. And we need you to clear the path. The situation, General Sterling said, gesturing to the chaos of the VIP suite, is that this hospital has been operating without a commander. And I don't leave my men, or my family, in unsecured territory. He handed the folded paper to Rachel. It wasn't a deployment order for overseas. It was a terrifyingly thick administrative dossier labeled St. Jude's Trauma Center. Internal audit. I didn't just come here because David called me, Sterling continued, his voice dropping so the senator wouldn't hear. I sent Sergeant Torres to find you. He's been checking every level 1 trauma center on the eastern seaboard for 6 months. We knew you were alive, Rachel. A surgeon with your hands doesn't just stop saving people. We just needed to know if you were ready to come back to the fight. Rachel looked at the general, then at the open door where Torres was waiting in his wheelchair, looking exhausted but triumphant. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had hunted her down, not to expose her, but to bring her home. This is ridiculous. Dr. Thorne broke the moment, his voice shrill with desperation. He tried to push past the MPs. I am the chief resident. You cannot arrest me on the word of a PTSD-riddled grunt and a disgraced nurse. I saved this boy. The logs will prove. The logs? A cold voice interrupted from the doorway. It was Mrs. Halloway, the administrator. She was holding a tablet, her face pale. She had been watching the feed. The logs show that the localized power failure in OR 3 lasted 4 minutes. During that time, the biometric sensors on the surgical instruments were active. They were registered to Nurse Bennett's RFID tag. Yours, Dr. Thorne, registered 0 movement until the lights came back on. Thorne froze. The technology he loved so much, the high-tech traceable smart hospital systems he bragged about to donors, had just hanged him. You falsified the operative report, Halloway said, her voice trembling with anger. And you endangered the life of a patient to cover your own incompetence. Thorne opened his mouth, but the general had heard enough. He nodded to the MPs. "Get him out of my sight," Sterling ordered. The handcuffs clicked. It was a sharp, final sound. Thorne was dragged out, his heels skidding on the carpet, passing the very woman he had fired an hour ago. He looked at Rachel, expecting smugness. Instead, he found only pity. She didn't hate him, she had already forgotten him. He was just another casualty of poor training. As the door closed on Thorne's protests, the room quieted. The nurses were cleaning the patient. The senator was gripping the general's hand, murmuring thanks. Sterling turned back to Rachel. He reached onto the side table where someone had left a long, pristine white coat, Thorne's coat, discarded in the panic. The general picked it up. He looked at the embroidered name Dr. M. Thorne, then ripped the stitching out with a single violent tug. He held the coat open for her. "The board has already been briefed," Sterling said. "They need a director of trauma. Someone who can operate in the dark. Someone who leads from the front." Rachel looked at the coat. For 5 years, she had worn blue scrubs as a penitence, hiding from the title she felt she didn't deserve because she had survived when her team hadn't. She looked at her hands, still stained with the blood of the boy she had just saved. "I'm not a politician, General," Rachel said softly. "I don't do fundraisers." "Good," Sterling smiled, a dry, humorless expression. "Because we have enough politicians. We need a Valkyrie." Rachel took a breath. She reached out, sliding her arms into the sleeves. The weight of the coat felt heavy like armor. She buttoned it, covering the faded blue scrubs, covering the past. She looked up, her eyes clear for the first time in years. "Orders received, General," she said. The storm had broken. The rain that had lashed St. Jude's for hours had reduced to a fine, glittering mist. On the rooftop helipad, the wind was cold, carrying the smell of ozone and wet concrete. Rachel leaned against the railing, looking out over the city lights flickering back to life grid by grid. She lit a cigarette, a habit she kept meaning to quit, and watched the smoke curl into the night air. The heavy metallic clackwhir of a wheelchair announced his arrival before he spoke. "You know smoking kills, Doc?" Sergeant Torres said, rolling up beside her. He had cleaned up. The blood was gone, his leg was freshly dressed, and he was wearing a clean hospital gown with a stolen Marine Corps jacket draped over his shoulders. "So does shrapnel, David," Rachel replied, not looking around. "We take our chances." They stood and sat in silence for a long moment. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had seen the worst of humanity and survived to tell the tale. "Thorne is in county lockup," Torres said, looking at the skyline. "Sterling says he's going to push for a revocation of his license. The senator is backing him." "He was just scared," Rachel said, tapping the ash. "Fear makes people do stupid things." "Fear made you save a kid in the dark," Torres countered. He turned his chair slightly to face her. "You stopped running." Rachel looked at him. She thought about the photo in her pocket, the faces of the men she had lost. For 5 years she had run from their memory, thinking that being a doctor was an insult to their sacrifice. But tonight, with the white coat flapping in the wind around her, she realized the truth. The only way to honor the dead was to fight for the living. "I didn't stop running," Rachel corrected him gently, tossing the cigarette away. "I just reached the checkpoint." She turned from the railing, the Ice Queen facade gone, replaced by something stronger, something tempered in fire. She looked at the door leading back down to the trauma ward, where the alarms were ringing, where the chaos was waiting, where the war never really ended. "Ready to go back to work, Sergeant?" she asked. Torres grinned, a feral, happy expression. He spun his chair around, ready to follow her into the breach once more. "Ora, ma'am," he said. "Lead the way." Sergeant Torres dragged himself out of a recovery bed, ripped out his IVs, and stood on a shattered leg just to show Rachel the respect she deserved. If he can do that while bleeding out, you can lift your thumb 1 inch to hit that like button. Don't be like the hospital staff who just watched in silence. Subscribe to join the squad and comment "Ora" below if you'd never leave a soldier behind. Or just scroll away. I'm sure Dr. Thorne would appreciate your silence.